to the AfterParty, Conversations with Spy Party Players. Today I'm speaking with cmuratori, or cmuratori in Spy Party. Casey is a lifelong software developer who has worked on numerous projects from places like Microsoft and Rad Game Tools, including, and perhaps most notably, at least in the industry, the Granny Animation Software Development Kit. Casey, thank you very much for coming on the show.
Thank you for having me.
Great. So the sort of like high concept reason I wanted to speak with you is A, you're someone who's familiar with Spy Party and close friends with Chris, so I'm sure we can get lots of interesting stories about that. But also you're someone with, we'll get there. But also you're someone who's got a lot of experience working on 3D animation technology in games, and so I was hoping, and perhaps like I'm not a technical-minded person, and perhaps the way I'm like thinking about asking this may be the wrong way, and so you might have to sort of help us to find what's the like most fun material to talk about. But I was hoping you could explain how 3D animation pipelines work in games, so that we as players of a game like Spy Party can sort of appreciate what's going on under the hood when characters are moving about the party and doing stuff.
Sure, I can give you a little a primer. Essentially, the part that I would expect probably a lot of players are somewhat familiar with, you know, maybe some people have absolutely no idea how 3D stuff gets made, but a lot of players probably have a little bit of an idea, even if they're not interested in development too much, in that they know there's, you know, these sort of 3D programs that artists will use to make, you know, character animation assets like Maya or 3D Studio Max or, you know, Mudbox, ZBrush, these sorts of things. But for those who literally don't know at all, I'll just give kind of the brief summary of what that is. Essentially, there's going to be a productivity tool of some kind that artists use to create 3D models, and they create them nowadays using a process that's actually not that dissimilar to how traditional sculpting worked in the real world. You know, typically they'll have sort of this like digital clay kind of that they see on the computer screen that they kind of like smush around and start to form like the shapes of characters and stuff like this, and they will, you know, model them much the way an original sculptor did, only with, you know, sort of the drawback that it's on a 2D surface that they can't manipulate with their hands, but with the benefit that it's got all these additional tools, undo, and different kinds of sculpting that you can't do in the real world. And the other sort of thing that's interesting about it is it's a slightly different, you know, if you're familiar with how people build things. In the real world, it's typically constructive. You're adding things. I'm sorry, I have that backwards. It's typically destructive. You're taking like a block of marble and you're chipping away at it to produce a sculpture. In 3D, software package is usually the opposite of that, right? You're kind of building up by adding material to a thing is typically more the way that 3D sculpting works. But you can find really, if you go on YouTube or something like that and just search for something like ZBrush, ZBrush tutorial, or Mudbox tutorial, something like that, you can find videos that show people doing this process. So for anybody who's not aware about how that initial part of the process starts, you can go check that out. At that point, typically what the artist has produced is sort of this really high resolution, detailed, three-dimensional thing inside the computer that represents a very sort of probably unusable in a game scenario kind of an art asset. And the next step of the process is typically to paint it, meaning to go kind of over that surface using a digital painting tool again. It's very similar to spray painting in the real world. You're basically going to go through and kind of put sort of material information and color information on it. Again, there's a lot of digital nuance to this, and again, you can find a lot of videos about this sort of process if you want to see it in more detail. But typically, they'll produce sort of this really high resolution kind of detailed version of whatever the art asset is. Now, in Spy Party in particular, I don't actually know. John Cimino is the artist who does the character characters on Spy Party. I don't know exactly how he models his characters. I believe he might not use that step of ZBrush and Mudbox modeling that's more typical these days. He might do most of his work in Maya, but I'm not sure. So let me move to the next part of the process.
Well, I will say that I did speak to them about a year or so ago. He said he sort of transitions between Maya and ZBrush for that. So ZBrush he'll like use for sort of finer details like the face and the hands, but then he'll sort of take it back to Maya for the more like general modeling.
Perfect. Okay. So so inside Maya, what Maya is, if you look at what these packages actually do, so Mudbox and ZBrush, it looks like ZBrush is the one that he uses, I guess, in this case. Those are for the just digital sculpting and painting, and that's really all they're set out to do. So they try to present the artist with a really abstract version of the thing that they're creating that's designed to remove as many barriers to the artistic process as possible, right? They're supposed to feel a lot more like a natural artistic process and not about sitting around thinking about how a computer is actually working and considering these models. Now, Maya, on the other hand, is a different type of art package, and that's in the category of Modo, Maya, 3D Studio Max, Softimage, Lightwave, these sorts of packages. And what these are is they're sort of, for lack of a better term, they're general digital 3D packages. And what these are for is sort of asset assembly and manipulation. And they kind of take care of a very broad swath of the sort of art creation process. And they are usually not very good at any one particular thing, but they're kind of capable of doing a wide range of things. It might be a good way to think about it. So typically what happens, as in the case of Spy Party here, is you have a very specific tool for doing one of these very heavyweight processes like modeling and texturing a character model. And then you bring that into another one of these packages that's a generic package like Maya or 3D Studio Max, something like this, that you then do the second steps of the process in. Now, like Stuart was just saying, sometimes in Spy Party may be one of these, you ping pong back and forth. So you might start out making some things in Maya that are rough scaffolding or something that you then bring into ZBrush, do a bunch of detail work on, then come back to Maya and so on. Again, these are really dependent on the particular game, particular artist workflow, things like this. But in general, something like that will happen. What these tools are for, Maya, as opposed to ZBrush, is starting to look at the actual digital nitty-gritty of what's going on, because for games it typically matters. So what tends to happen in these is you need to start figuring out how you're going to get this beautiful, crazy, detailed model that you made in ZBrush into your actual game engine, in this case, Spy Party. And this is where I'm going to start answering the actual question, which is how does the art pipeline work? This is where considerations for the art pipeline start to take hold. So what has to happen at this point is the programmer and the artist have to have some understanding of how they're going to export a couple different things out of these art packages where the assets have been created into the engine where they can actually be played back and be used for the game. And the types of information that have to come out are typically the ones that are sort of created in Maya. Now, and they're typically produced by using, say, that information from ZBrush and are created in Maya. And they are a reasonable resolution mesh, a three-dimensional mesh, like triangles, like you would see. Hopefully most people are familiar with what a 3D mesh is. If not, you can Google 3D mesh and see an example of it. It's basically like a sort of almost like paper mache chicken wire sort of outline of what the model is. So a reasonable mesh for the character, a bunch of texture and displacement maps. Displacement maps are not always necessary, but texture maps pretty much always are. These are the color and fine detailed geometry information that will be wrapped around this mesh and to try to reproduce as close as possible all of the painting and detail work that was done in ZBrush. So those two things. A skeleton for this model, and what that is a system of sort of bones that are inlaid inside the model, and I'll be talking about that in a second when we move on to other parts of the pipeline, that is used to sort of figure out how this model is going to animate, and that's going to get into probably a lot of what Stuart's going to ask me about in the second set of questions that we'll be talking about. And also animation data for this skeleton. So basically, like the sorts of motions that it's going to do, walk cycles, idle animations, these sorts of things, that information is also created in Maya and has to be exported. So all of that information, it's a very complicated part of the game development process. In fact, it's because there's so many different parts of information. They're all stored in different ways. There's a lot of efficiency concerns. You're trying to match sort of this generic 3D tools idea of what's going on to what's happening in the game engine. And this is just a real rat's nest full of problems. You know, a Spy Party is an indie game. It's a small team, obviously. So, you know, we're talking about Chris and John sitting down to figure out how this is going to go, let's say. But on bigger projects, there are entire teams of people. Let's say Destiny or Destiny 2. At Bungie, there are entire groups of people whose job is nothing but working on this part of the process, because that is just how complicated art pipelines are. So once you kind of have an understanding, and this is worked out between the programmers and the artists, of what kinds of data and how it's going to be kind of moved out, the programmer will do one, or a programming team, will have one of two things that they'll do. Either they will license or use a freely available exporting process. And what this is it's a way of extracting the information from the art package like Maya and putting it onto disk in some format that's well understood. And then the programmers in their engine will either license like a middleware tool or have an engine that they've licensed which knows how to read those files, or they will implement their own importer that imports those exported files into their engine. And what this gives the engine is all of those raw materials that the artist created in a format that it can then use to create the visuals for the game. And again, these include things such as 3D meshes for each model, texture maps that are information about the color and surface material, reflectance, things like this of the surface, microgeometry, so fine detail, little bits of geometry, skeletons for understanding how they animate, and animations on those skeletons. And one detail that probably it might be relevant, out no discussion, but I'll throw it in there, is there's also a bunch of information that says how the mesh connects to the skeleton. So when the skeleton moves, the engine can tell how the mesh moves with that skeleton. So that's a separate step. It's called weighting, or vertex weighting, or deformation, deformers. There's a bunch of different ways there. Now I'm glossing over tons of things here, and as you can tell by my description, there's tons of things I have said, but there's tons of little details I haven't said. But hopefully that kind of gives you an idea of just the stages of this. There's a sculpting tool, painting tool, generic 3D assembly tool, all these sorts of things, depending what those are. They may exist in one package or multiple packages. In this case, we've got ZBrush and Maya in the mix. The artist does their work there. Then there is an export process from usually the generic assembly tool specifically, so from Maya out into a game engine format of some kind. Then the game engine will be loading that format in and doing something with it. There are even more complicated versions of this process where that exported data actually goes through a more lengthy sort of processing period on a server somewhere. You can imagine a much more complicated art process where there's like extra stuff that gets chewed through, optimization that happens, all sorts of things. So all of that is just, there's a ton of complexity in every stage of that, but hopefully that gives you an overview of just like basically where everything's happening. Does that sort of give basically what you're looking for, Stuart?
Yeah, that's a wonderful foundational description of like what's involved in the pipeline and all the components. So I looked at the website on Red Game Tools about Granny. So Granny, by the sounds of it, is essentially a single tool for that entire pipeline. Is that correct?
Yeah, essentially it is. What Granny, and I should disclaim the fact that when I developed Granny, it was 1999, And I stopped working on that product in 2004. So
yeah, sorry, this is probably like reaching a bit too far down memory lane.
Yeah, so I can tell you all the stuff from that era, but obviously what Granny is today, you know, I have no involvement with that project anymore, and so I can't speak to what it does this very day. But the original design implementation of it was exactly what you just said. It is essentially a tool for taking care of all of the process past the generic 3D tool. So it's something that does all of your exporting for you, it does all your importing for you, and it even has a runtime component that does your runtime sort of playback of these things as well. So it's kind of meant as a 3D pipeline you could just license and be able to, you know, make your own sort of engine very quickly by utilizing this and not have to worry about all those different parts, which, as I said, are very complicated. Now, in today's world, it's less of it's a product that doesn't make as much sense in today's world as it did in that world. And the reason for that is a lot more people use licensed engines today than they did back then. And so a lot of times, you know, as in 1999, 2000, almost every game was written on a custom engine at that time, right? The only games that weren't were ones that licensed like the Quake engine, or occasionally Half-Life 2's like Source engine or something, right? But nowadays, most people license the Unreal Engine or Unity or one of these kinds of things. And so typically what happens is that comes with an art pipeline. So one of the reasons, you know, I would imagine Rad Game Tools isn't, you know, crazy pushing Granny right now as their main product or anything is because it's still useful to a lot of people, but it's not as foundational a technology as it was back when it was originally developed, because nowadays people tend to need to license a whole engine, if that makes sense. So selling engine components is not as important as it once was, if that makes any sense.
Yeah, yeah. However, to projects like SpyParty, which is running on a custom engine, for projects like that, it would still be something that is relevant or used.
And ironically, even when very large companies, when they do roll their own engines, sometimes they choose to do it with Granny. So for example, I don't know if Destiny 2 is this way, but Destiny 1 licensed Granny for their exporter, if I remember correctly. So they were just like, we don't want to deal with that part of the process. So even though we have our whole own asset pipeline system that comes after the export process, we just don't want to deal with that. So it's a reasonable tool for anyone who's developing an engine to choose, certainly, and, you know, it makes sense in that context. But, you know, like I said, in the case where you've already inherited an engine, typically you're kind of not going to be, even if you wanted to, you probably wouldn't really be able to swap out their asset pipeline decisions. So if they happen to have decided to use something like Granny, then you're going to have to use something like Granny. If they decide to write their own, you're probably going to have to use theirs, right? Because it's very deeply ingrained in the whole workflow and how the engine works. It's not really something that can be switched after the engine made all its decisions about how all that data would be laid out and where it would be getting it from, and, you know, that sort of thing.
Right, right. Before we go into speaking about SpyParty, I'm curious just to get a bit of background about the project, even though, as you say, it's, speaking about Granny, perhaps something that isn't as resonant or used in what the modern game industry is. I want to learn a bit about, like, what originally took you to making the project, and sort of like, were you starting from square one as far as your education and knowledge in 3D animation when you first took on the project, or had you worked on 3D graphics technology before building Granny?
It was, I would say, my first really industrial strength engineering job in that arena, but I had worked on it before. I did a bunch of work on character animation at Gas Powered Games, some of which sort of shipped in Dungeon Siege, but most of that was heavily, like, I left long before that project got too far down the road, so I don't think it ended up using too much of the code that I'd written for that. And I had worked with Chris before that. What my first job, actually, that I ever had in the game industry was working with Chris Hecker And I did some work on 3D modeling stuff there. It wasn't character animation, but it was physics and geometry sorts of work. So I had a few years, like 2 or 3 years of experience with 3D stuff before I did Granny. But Granny was the first really serious engineering project I did on that. It was also the very first really licensable character, really the very first licensable integrated 3D component that I think ever succeeded in the game industry. Up until that point, no one had ever really tried to license something that fit into an engine quite so integral as something like the asset pipeline and runtime system for characters and meshes and all that sort of stuff. And a lot of people at the time actually were like, this isn't going to work. Like, it's not going to be successful. You can't do that. But we were fortunate in that we tried pretty hard to figure out how to do API design that would make that work, and we were able to do it. It took a while. It was about 2 years before we really got a system that could be plugged in easily to people's stuff, but it was a pretty big win for us, I think, and I was proud to be a part of that because I felt like that was a really, it's something that only those of us who do programming for a living and are passionate about it care about, really. Like, no one's ever going to care but us. But it was one of those like personal victories for me anyway that I just felt really proud about, because I was like, tons of people were telling us that this wasn't going to work when we started, and finally making it work was like a really big, like, oh yeah, like we felt like we did something hard because it wasn't expected to succeed. And that's always sort of the nicest tech win you can have, is when it wasn't expected to succeed and it does, because if you're expected to succeed, then you can only really fail, right?
Yeah.
So.
Yeah, no, it's great to prove someone wrong. It's a good feeling.
Well, not just that. I mean, I don't mean it in a spiteful way. I just mean more like when you know that the deck is kind of stacked against something you're doing, you feel like you've accomplished something, right? Whereas if it's just something that you think is probably should work, then you can only ever really feel bad if you don't get it to work. So it was nice in that sense. That's all.
Hey, wonderful. You mentioned you worked previous to that with Chris. What was it the two of you were working on?
So at that time, Chris was really interested in physics in games. And you have to rewind to the time, this was 1995. So way back then, physics in games wasn't really a thing. The only people who were really doing anything in that arena was Looking Glass. I don't know if you remember this company, but they were a pretty innovative game company back in the day. They did, for example, Ultima Underworld, which is considered a kind of a landmark title in sort of the history of gaming. They did System Shock. They did Flight Unlimited. They did Thief: The Dark Project. And they were just a company that, they always kind of try to, they aimed a little too high always. They're a company that always aimed just a bit past where we really could do things in the game industry. And so they never really had the kind of breakout success that a company like id Software or one of their contemporaries had, who kind of aimed more for doing exactly what we could do at that time and doing it great. Looking Glass always tried to go further, right? And as a result, their stuff was always a little bit, just not quite there. But they also were always shipping things that were kind of amazing in how did they get as far as they did down this road that just didn't even seem plausible, right? And so it's only fitting, I guess, that they were some people who were really trying to bring more game physics into things. So, for example, with Flight Unlimited, one of the interesting things there was that was a game that shipped where instead, flight simulations at that time would typically use what's called a flight model, and a flight model is a thing that boils a plane essentially down to a few coefficients that say things like how much lift there is at a particular velocity and bearing, and how much, or I should say pitch or whatever, or how much drag there is, or this sort of thing, right? And so it's a pretty simple computational model. But it doesn't capture the real feel of an airplane. It's like a simplified version of airplane. And there was a guy at Looking Glass. His name was Seamus Blackley. People who recognize that name will know him as one of the people who pushed to make the original Xbox a reality. He's sort of somewhat famous in that circle for being one of the people who got Microsoft into the console business, and you can Google for his name, Seamus Blackley, Blackley, I believe, if you want to know more about that. But he was a person who had a physics background, traditional physics background, and he wanted to put real physics into flight sims. So he wanted to make a game where he really simulated airflow over the wings of a plane and really figured out, how to solve for stuff like, when the flaps are like this, that'll create turbulence here, which will make the rudder not work as well here, and blah, blah, blah. Now,
holy cow.
People can argue about how successful this was or not, but that's irrelevant to this story. It's also out of my area of expertise. I know very little about fluid dynamics. But the important part was Chris knew the people at Looking Glass because he had worked on a project called WinG, which was something at Microsoft that was sort of the precursor to DirectX. Chris was one of the first people to really recognize the fact that games needed to be on Windows. Chris doesn't get credit for this, but I mean, he is the reason why we have games on Windows, to be honest. I mean, I was there at the time, I remember, and he was the one who was like, we have to have a way to get direct frame buffer access to Windows games so we can have them on here and get them off of DOS, right? And so he had done this project called WinG at Microsoft, which was the first thing that really enabled that sort of thing to happen. And as a result, he knew a bunch of people in the game industry, and he knew people from Looking Glass as a result. And so he had met Seamus Blackley and kind of caught, I mean, this is me telling this here, so, Chris may come on your program later and say that Casey's totally wrong, this is not what happened. But this was my read of it at the time, because I remember, again, like I said, I was there, so this is just my impression. He had kind of caught the physics bug from Seamus. Seamus is a fairly charismatic fellow, I don't mind saying. He's fairly persuasive. I mean, he is the guy who got the Xbox project started. And you can imagine how hard something like that is to do at Microsoft. It's basically a giant personal charisma kind of a thing where you've got to convince a lot of people that you're not saying something stupid, that you're having a good idea, and that they should go along with it. And so Chris kind of got interested in that from Seamus, either because Seamus is very persuasive or just because this is something that resonated with Chris personally. You'd have to ask Chris. But he really wanted to do some work with physics in games. And so what we were working on at that time was just anything that was a physical game was basically what Chris wanted to do. He just wanted to do something where we would be doing physics sim in a game. And so we played around with some various ideas for that and kind of had some early physics stuff working that was pretty advanced compared to what was happening in games at the time, certainly, but it was pretty buggy. And we never really got to the point where we had a game that was really playable. And so I ended up leaving that company to go, work for reals on an actual project, because at that point it was not really going anywhere. But I learned a lot, especially pretty much everything I know about math. I learned on that project, actually, because it was physics, which is one of the most involved math sorts of stuff you can do in games. So that kind of put me in a good position to deal with animation stuff in the future, to be sure.
Wow, that almost sounds similar to, I remember hearing Jonathan Blow describing his sort of first game company and how it was commercially a failure, but he learnt basically everything or built a large amount of experience from working on something that was kind of out of his league or a large project.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's really rare that people can do something sort of technologically advanced or special if they haven't failed a few times at doing something big like that, or bitten off more than they can chew. And the reason for that is just you've got to push yourself to learn some of this stuff and to break new ground on some of this stuff. And so that comes with failure, with a high risk of failure. And so I do think that a lot of times, if you look at something like Braid, which was programmed almost entirely by John, right? Having had the experience of going through all the stuff he went through before that, I'm sure was absolutely crucial in him being able to do such a, monumental programming project for one person. I mean, you look at something like Braid and just think about how much more complicated that game was programming-wise than almost any platformer then or now. I mean, it has all these multiple crazy time interrelation rules plus rewind plus impermanence plus permanence. But, it's like these kinds of things are just, they're really hard to program, and very few people can really do it. And when you look back at the kinds of people who are able to do it, you're going to find that they had a history of pushing on things. You don't have to have had that happen if you just to make a successful game. There are plenty of successful games that were people's probably, first try almost at things if they're just not super technologically ambitious, right? But for these small teams of one programmer, two programmers trying to do something kind of groundbreaking somewhere, I think you are going to kind of see that background because you have to have really pushed yourself and have gotten used to that, I think, in order to be successful. That would be my guess.
Right. Wonderful. Stepping back to speaking about SpyParty, I wanted to sort of ask you about, so something I find quite engaging and interesting about SpyParty is that it is a game where animation and sort of the subtleties of observing characters animating is sort of integral to the gameplay experience, and so it's something that players are actively spending a lot of attention on, looking at how characters like blend between different animations and distinguishing like an idle from a talking animation. So I just wanted to ask if you could sort of explain to us how like what's going on in a few sort of specific situations. So starting with animation blending. So say I'm one of the characters at the party, so I'm standing in just like an idle, what would be I guess called like an idle animation. So it looks like my character's not doing anything, but obviously they're playing just like a mild animation of them standing, and then I like press the W key and then I start walking. So what is happening to transition the character between those two animation cycles of the idle animation and the walking animation?
Okay, so there's a there's a lot of different ways that those sorts of things can be implemented. And I'll try to give you some perspective on sort of the range of options there.
Right.
And one of the things that I should caveat here is I am not familiar with SpyParty's animation system, right? So I can't give you a lot of insight into exactly what Chris has done so far. I think he started with CAS, if I remember correctly, because I think SpyParty originally came out of the Indie Game Jam code base, if I remember correctly, which was a slightly modified version of CAS, which is sort of a freely available character animation system thing. And so I can tell you how that system would do it, but I just want to caveat it with Chris is, if you look at his track record programming-wise, he is responsible for perhaps one of the most landmark character animation systems ever created, and that is the one for Spore. Now, it's not about trying to make realistic characters, animate believably or anything like that, but it does tackle an extremely hard problem, which is how to animate characters that the player themselves create, and furthermore create in an arbitrary morphology, right? Which is a really interesting and complicated problem. So Chris knows a lot about character animation, and he could obviously modify pretty much any aspect of the character animation in SpyParty, and I don't know to what extent he may have modified certain parts of it, but I assume, because Chris tends to, I think, spend most of his time on the gameplay aspects of things, I assume he hasn't spent a huge amount of time on the animation system, because I don't think that's a big priority for SpyParty, but I could be wrong. So I can kind of give you the capsule overview, but again, you'd have to ask Chris for specifics on like what exactly is happening in any particular circumstance, because he is somebody with a tremendous amount of character animation technology knowledge. So unlike somebody who, for example, just licenses or uses an existing character system and has no idea how it really works, Chris would be capable of dramatically changing the behavior of the character animation system, and that would not be a huge undertaking for him, right? He already knows how to do that stuff. So that said, I'll start with the very basics of animation blending. So if you recall, in the answer to the original question about what a 3D pipeline is or looks like, I mentioned the fact that you start off with a character mesh in one of these generic assembly packages, and you give it a skeleton, right? I talked about having the skeleton in there. Mm-hmm. So for all intents and purposes in SpyParty, for the question you asked, we can talk just about the skeleton. Now, there are other things that don't necessarily have to be skeletal-based. They're called morph targets. These are about deforming the geometry in non-skeletal ways. I'll leave getting into that until you ask me about something facial animation related, and if you don't, we'll just skip it. But for something like a walk cycle, so gross deformation of the character, where by gross I don't mean ugly, I mean large scale. For that kind of character animation where we're talking about moving whole limbs around, as is in the case of a walk cycle, then what we're really talking about is animation on the skeleton. And this skeleton, if you imagine getting rid of the person and replacing them with an old anatomical skeleton, that's not a very bad place to start for understanding how this sort of thing works. And what's going on here is, if you think about how a human works, most of the stuff in a human is fairly smushy, right? You're kind of a mushy piece of meat. You have muscle and fat and tendons and ligaments, and all of these things can stretch and compress and all these other sorts of things, right? And so if you imagine a programmer looking at this situation, that's the kind of thing that gives them the cold sweats, because there's just so much crazy information and deformation physical processes happening in there that it can be pretty difficult to figure out how to get that into a sane system they can use and present to an animator or whatever else. So instead, what you can think of is a simplified version of a human, which is just their bone structure. The bone structure of a human doesn't really bend or deform. A bone is brittle, it's hard, right? Excuse me. And so, except for the case where you've fractured something or had an injury, your bones generally are just rigid pieces. They can move relative to each other, but the bones themselves don't deform. They don't bend. They don't stretch, right? And so, that is the basis for the initial gross deformation of the character, is basically considering a simplified version of a human skeleton to be underlying the character. And what we'll do is we'll animate that, and we'll just have rules for how the rest of the body conforms to that, so that we can deal with a more simplified system and then work our way upwards, okay? So most character animation starts with this basic concept of rigid pieces, and then it builds the deformable, more smushy parts on top of that for added realism. But at a base layer, you're talking about that skeletal section. So in the case that you talked about, you have two things going on. One is that there is a notion of this skeleton in space, and that is the thing that's being animated. So at any given time, the game engine has an understanding of what the configuration of that skeleton is. In fact, I don't know if you can access it in SpyParty, but Chris can probably access it in SpyParty even if you can't. There's probably a mode which shows this skeleton and what its state is, because programmers will use this for debugging. If a character's joint is behaving all weirdly and spinning around or something like this, or they're inverted, their head's going around like the Exorcist baby, or who knows what else is happening, a lot of times a programmer will have to first look at the skeleton to see if it's configured properly. Like, is it a problem with the skeleton here, or is it a problem with how we're assembling the mesh after we know where the skeleton is? So I don't know if you can see that in SpyParty or not, but it's there. So the game engine always has an understanding of where the skeleton is. Now, on top of that, there is typically a system which then tracks what are the things that need to be happening to the skeleton at this particular part in time. And the simplest way to imagine what's going on with this is to think about if you've ever seen something like a movie editing package like Adobe Premiere or iMovie, or something that edits sound like GarageBand or something like this. And if you've ever seen one of these packages, I hope you have. If you haven't, Maybe try Googling one of them and you can see it. But basically what these are is they're sort of multi-track mixer paradigm programs. And what you'll see is you'll see a bunch of like tracks sort of listed vertically, and then you'll have like what's going on the tracks listed horizontally over time. When you hit play, there's a little play cursor that goes across, and what you hear out the speakers or what you see in the video or whatever is sort of a composite of all of the things that are supposed to be happening at that time. Well, that is very much like what a game engine is going to do with the skeleton. There can only be one resulting version of where the skeleton is for any frame of the game, right? When we're going to produce an actual image of the game, we have to know exactly one position for the skeleton so we know how to draw the character and deform it to that skeleton, right? We can't have multiple places where the skeleton is because the character would look all freaky and have multiple copies of their limbs everywhere or something like this. So that's no good. We have to have one. So what a game engine is doing is it has a number of sort of tracks like that which say what animations or constraints are happening to this character at this particular time, and its job is to figure out what is the end result of the skeleton on that particular frame. So in the case you said where we're going from an idle animation to a walk animation, what the game engine is thinking about that time is, okay, I know there was an idle animation playing on this character. What that means is somebody in an art package like Maya, like we talked about before, has just animated like in a traditional sense, frame by frame or using keyframes and interpolation or whatever, has animated what it looks like for a character to just stand there, right? Now they've also done in a separate file an animation of them walking. So these two pieces of information have been crafted by the animator beforehand, and we know what a character looks like standing, and we know what a character looks like walking. And the game engine has both of these things. And what it knows is right now, overlapping that time slice we're on, is an idle animation at some point in the animation, right? It's been playing for a little while, so we're 2/3 of the way through, let's say, our idle animation, and that is, if we weren't going to start walking, that is the frame of that idle animation we're on, 2/3 in, that is what the character's skeleton should look like, right? It should look exactly like it looked like the artist made it at that point in the animation. But now, what's going to happen is that the version of the character walking that the artist made, we're now asking the game engine, right? The character is pushing the W button or something like this. They're saying walk forward. Well, now we have to, the game engine has a conflict, essentially. What you're basically doing is you're layering, in that track timeline view I asked you to imagine, you're layering on another animation on top that now has to start up that's going to overlap the idle animation. And we need to figure out what to do about this, because again, the skeleton can't be in two places at once. So now, there's multiple different ways that this sort of thing can be resolved, and I'll sort of walk you through what has to happen here. Now, much like in a sound editing package, you might imagine, well, what happens in, let's say, a DJ, right? You're at a club and you're listening to that music, like we were talking about before, in some kind of track version. They want to stop one song and start another. That's what the animation is sort of doing here. We're trying to stop idling and start walking. Well, one of the things they'll typically do if you're a DJ is you'll overlay the two songs you're playing. You'll fade the old one out as you fade the new one in, right? So you're kind of bringing down the volume of the thing that was happening, and you're bringing up the volume of the thing that's about to happen, because that way you don't have an abrupt change. Like no one sees a hard snap between old song and new song. So it gets rid of the jarring nature of that transition. Well, the exact same thing can happen in the game engine, and I'm guessing this is the basis of probably what AfterParty is doing. Again, like I don't want to say exactly what it's doing because I don't look at the code, so you'd have to ask Chris about that. But that exact kind of process is now what has to happen inside a game like AfterParty. The idle animation is playing, and we now want the walk animation to play. If we simply cut, so we stopped the idle animation immediately and started the walk animation immediately, what you would see is a discontinuous pop between where the character was standing in their idle pose and immediately into a walking pose, right? It would just discontinuously move. No interpolation, no nothing, it would just bam, it's in the new pose, right? And you've probably all seen this happen in games when there's a bug, right? You've probably seen this happen when there was a bug. It's not supposed to, but you'll see it. And this is not just in beta software. You can see this even in commercial games when there's a bug. You'll see things pop like that, right? Well, that's what's happening. is something in the engine didn't handle the transition properly. Okay, so what do we do to get rid of that pop? Well, much like the sound metaphor, what we can do is sort of try to ease between these two competing notions of where the skeleton of the character has to be by using something called interpolation, which I sort of mentioned in passing but didn't really describe. And what that is saying, well, if I know that the skeleton has to be in this place in this animation, but it has to be in this other place in this animation that I want to transition to, what I can do is slowly combine those two results as if to swing the joints between where they would be in either case over some amount of time. So to give an example, if my hand is down, my arm is down by my side in one animation, and it wants to be up 90 degrees, flailed out like a Da Vinci pose in some other animation, I can slowly bring it from the down to the up, right? Just kind of gradually interpolate those two together. I will get sort of a smooth transition where my character kind of blends in this nice sort of smooth way from where they were to where they should be. And if I'm actively playing both animations at that time, then I'm still kind of moving in my idle animation, and I'm moving in my walk animation, and I'm blending between the continuously updating positions of the two skeletons, so I kind of more seamlessly go into my walk. However, there's a number of drawbacks with just this basic approach if you do nothing else on top of it. For example, one of the things you will see very often in games, and you'll have to forgive my ignorance of Spy Party, I have not played anywhere near the amount of Spy Party that all of you who are listening to this podcast, and of course you, Stuart, have played. So I can't speak Spy Party specifically, but what you will see in many games, if all they do is a blend, a lot of times you'll notice some very obvious artifacts. For example, the feet of the character will slide along the ground. Why? Because all they are doing is blending between the stationary foot positions of the idle animation and the moving foot placement of the walk, and in that process, some slide will occur, because nothing in that process was at all cognizant of the physical fact, completely metaphorical to the game engine, but concrete to you and I, that the foot was on the ground and the source of the motion. Because remember, game engines are a faux reality. They don't obey physical rules. They don't have to, right? So the fact that a foot stays stationary on the ground is purely an artifact of the fact that the animator kept it there when they made the animation. So in the idle animation, the foot may always look like it's nicely in contact with the ground. In the walk animation, they may have also done that, been careful to make sure the walk animation always was on the ground. But when you blend between the two, there is no animator there. It's just an algorithm just smoothly moving the foot from one place to another. It has no idea the foot's supposed to stay placed. So that's the kind of artifact you will see during a raw blend of the kind I just said. Do you happen to know, Stuart, can you think in Spy Party, does that happen or not?
Well, it was interesting you brought up the point of sharp cuts where blending doesn't occur. That's actually a gameplay feature with regards to specific missions. So, for instance, when a character picks up or puts down a statue, it seems to blend smoothly from the character standing to picking up the statue. But there's a constraint the player has to consider when putting the statue back down. They have to do it from the rest pose, where the character is holding the statue at the middle. So the character sort of alternates between a rest pose holding it at the middle, and then will animate from there to two other poses of like inspecting the statue holding it up high, or like inspecting the statue holding it down low. And they'll always then come back to this rest pose. So the player actually has to be aware of when they're at the rest pose to put it back, because the animation to put it down will only smoothly transition from that rest pose. So if they do it outside of there, when it's high or low, the character will do that snap transition to putting it down, and that's actually a hard tell. So the game actually requires the player to be aware of what it looks like when an animation isn't blending, like when there's a snap transition, and there are subtler versions of that when putting a book away or when taking a drink in conversation. The sort of idle listening animation has a sort of neutral rest pose. The spy has to, if they want to take a sip of their drink or finish their drink, do it from that rest pose. Otherwise, there'll be a snap, and it may be subtle depending on where the character is in the idle animation, or it may be overt. And if the sniper's paying a lot of attention, that's a hard tell that will get them killed.
That's awesome. So basically, if I may, that is basically interesting because it's essentially turned something that's normally a problem in an engine into something that's like a game feature,
Yeah,
which is pretty great. Because obviously, one thing that I didn't mention in there is one way you can solve this problem in an engine is to not ever do any blending and just have all of your animations line up so that if they're played back to back exactly, they are at the right pose. And you can imagine that working for something like, well, okay, if a character's going to start walking, then we just make sure that the start walking animation starts from the last frame of the idle animation, and then we don't let anyone start walking until they've played one full cycle of their idle animation, right? And normally this is horrible for gameplay because normally you want the character to start moving exactly when you push the button. This was the annoying part of say, Prince of Persia, the original Prince of Persia game, like way back on like the Apple II or whatever.
Oh, yeah.
These games, they wanted to make their animations really smooth, and they made sure that the sprites all followed one after the other. But what it meant is when you hit the jump button, it was going to finish playing the run loop till the end and then start the jump animation, which meant it was really hard to time jumps, right? Because you had to do it way back, way before you actually wanted to jump. And so normally we've gotten rid of all that in modern game engines because it's awful. So we use all kinds of other tricks. There's a lot more stuff beyond blending, which we haven't talked about. But usually they use all sorts of tricks there. But one of the interesting things about Spy Party is, yeah, like if the whole point of this game is to try and disguise your movement, then you can start making things like, hey, yeah, look, you're responsible for trying to make your character look continuous. We're not going to do it for you because that's part of the game. And there's very few other games that could ever really say that that was an acceptable game design decision, but in this case, it makes sense.
And it's tricky. It's something that takes a while to learn. One of the most difficult initial things for players to learn is the idea of walking without pause. So there are various pads where characters stand at. So they might walk to the pad in front of the bookshelf with the intent of picking up a book and put it back, and then they'll intentionally walk from there to a pad for a conversation and start playing talk animations. They'll never, with some exceptions, which make it more confusing to explain to new players, they'll never stop dead between one of these pads, and that sort of
Right.
like fidgeting and stopping, which is, you know, perfectly common and normal if you're playing a platforming game or a shooting game. You're like always like stopping and going and adjusting your movement. If you do that in Spy Party, it'll get you killed because an attentive sniper will be able to tell when someone isn't sort of following the normal behavior of like intentionally
Yes.
walking between discrete places.
Yes.
So I realized that didn't really lead anywhere. But I thought that was interesting.
Well, yeah, I mean, it makes perfect sense there, right? It's like, yeah, you pretty much have to, that sort of takes it up one level and say, you also have to emulate an AI quite well, right? And know that it's only going to pathfind between these two places and do it like this, and it's never going to do other things. So, you know.
Yeah, actually, that leads into a good question. So Chris has sort of referred to how he thinks the game currently has like a terrible pathfinder, and he's eventually going to fix it. Though like despite him having said that, it's still like worked robustly in the game, and everyone's like really easily able to like understand how to move about the space and play at like competitive levels for thousands of hours. But he described it as an A-star Pathfinder. Can you explain to us what the heck an A-star Pathfinder is?
Yes, I can explain to you what an A-star Pathfinder is. Unfortunately, the explanation of an A-star Pathfinder is largely going to be uninteresting because the only thing that differentiates an A-star Pathfinder from, say, a Dijkstra Pathfinder is the fact that it is an optimized version of it. The paths it finds are not different. So from the player's perspective, there is no real difference between an A-star Pathfinder and a Dijkstra Pathfinder.
Perhaps you could explain what a Dijkstra.
Yes, I will explain them both, but it is more efficient if the A-star Pathfinder is a more efficient variant in most circumstances, in most practical circumstances. So if you consider the problem of pathfinding, there's a lot of aspects of it. But for a lot of games, and I guess Spy Party is one of these games if it's using A-star as the primary thing that you'd be talking about when you talk about the pathfinding, a lot of them can be boiled down to pathfinding on a graph representation of something, right? And so to give an example of what I mean by this, you would think of pathfinding potentially as being a continuous operation that allows you to plan motion anywhere, right? If I say I'm going to go walk from my house to the supermarket, you're not necessarily expecting me to move along, say, a rigid series of lines that goes directly somewhere. You're expecting me to kind of continuously move throughout the space however I wish to get there, right? But even in the real world, we do tend to, at some point, loft up into a graph sort of concept to do our large-scale pathfinding. What do I mean by this? Well, if I ask you how to get from my house to City Hall, you might go, oh, okay, take this road down to this intersection, then take this road to this intersection, take this road to City Hall, right?
Right, kind of abstracting the process.
Yes, you've taken the real world, which is continuous and open and complete. You could move through it so many ways, and you've boiled it down to essentially a graph. You've said, I essentially have points, which are intersections of the roadway, and I have lines connecting them, which are roads, and I'm just going to tell you which lines to follow to which intersections. That's all, right? And now we've taken the full 3D space of the real world completely out of it, and we've flattened it down to just this little series of points and lines, right? And incidentally, when Google Maps does pathfinding to tell you how to get from one place to the other, it's using a graph. It's not doing a continuous motion solve. It's taking the road information it has, and it's using a graph to figure out what the path is. So I'll start by saying Dijkstra algorithm, A-star algorithm, these are pathfinding algorithms that operate on something that fundamentally looks like a graph. And so what we're talking about here is a bunch of point locations like intersections in a roadway connected by lines such as roads, right? That's what we're talking about. So what happens with a Dijkstra pathfinding algorithm is you specify two things. You say where you want to start and where you want to end, right? And technically with a Dijkstra pathfinder, it actually doesn't quite matter where you start. You could think of it more as just saying, where do you want to end, right? So for the real full, A-star, like I said, it changed a little bit, but for the real Dijkstra version, really all you're talking about is just an end point. So what you say is, for example, to use the previous thing that I just said with the roadways, if I say I want to get from my house to City Hall, you don't ever really first tell the computer you're starting at my house. You just say, we're going to City Hall. And we never say where we start, okay? So then what we do is we say, all right, let's compute how long it will take to get to City Hall from all of the intersections immediately connected to City Hall, right? So for example, there's City Halls on some block, and there's some intersections around it, and the distance from the intersection to the front door of City Hall, let's say, right, is going to be the time that it would take to get from each of the intersections. So we can all see how we would do that, right? We know what that is. Then we could say, all right, let's take one of those intersections and look at all of the roads that come out from it. Those lead to some other intersections. How long would it take us to go down that road to the intersection, right? So for this new intersection we found, we know it would take however long it takes us to get to the intersection we're at, right? And however long it takes us to go down the road from that intersection to this new intersection. And that would be how long it would take to get there, right? So I'm kind of working my way outwards and going, okay, if I want to get to this new intersection that's down some road from where I'm checking, it's going to take however long it takes to get down the road to the intersection, plus however long it took me to get to the intersection I'm starting at, right? Does that make basic sense?
Yeah, it does.
Okay.
Yeah.
Sorry. Ask a question. Okay.
Go.
So continuing from there, remember this is a huge connected network, this road system, right? So you might ask the question, what happens if I loop upon myself, right? Like what happens if I'm sort of spreading out and I have intersection A and intersection B that I've arrived at from separate routes, and now I travel down the road from A and I travel down the road from B, and I find that I can get to an intersection from either side, right? So what do I determine the time it takes to get to that one? Well, this is supposed to find optimal paths, right? What we're trying to do is find like the shortest path, let's say, or the fastest route, right, between somewhere and City Hall. Well, okay, I want to take whichever route was least. So if it's faster, if I know how long it took me to get to A, I know how long it took me to get to B, I know how long the road is from A to C, I know how long the road is from B to C, so I just pick whichever one would have got me there quicker, and that's how long I say it took me to get to that intersection. Right?
Yes.
Does that make sense?
Yes, that does.
So basically, that's all this is. This algorithm just starts from the end, it works its way outward to all of the nodes in the graph, right? And it basically just says, and it doesn't really even quite have to do it that way, but I mean, you can imagine that's basically what's going on. And basically what it has done by the time it visits all of the intersections in our street map, it has assigned them each a time, right? It's assigned them each a thing that says, this is how long it would take me to get here from City Hall. Does that make good sense?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it does.
Okay, so how does this help us with pathfinding would be the question, right? All I've done is assign a time to each intersection in my town, right? So how do I get to City Hall? I haven't answered this question, right? Well, it turns out it's really easy once you have that map. I walk out my door and I look at the two intersections on either side of the street that I'm on. Whichever one has the lower time, I walk to it. Now I look at all of the intersections that I could get to from streets that come from there. Which one has the lowest time? I walk to it. I just keep walking to the intersection that's connected to the one I'm at with the lowest time, and I get to City Hall along the fastest route.
Huh. That's very, like,
Makes sense?
yeah, it does. And it was very interesting, your description of it, because that brings up another feature of the game. This is sort of becoming like a theme of Spy Party, is that the player basically has to learn to internalize how the AI move about the space. The AI characters at the party sort of decide ahead of time where they're going to go, and then they always take the shortest path, and so the player has to learn to walk in a manner that is efficient. They can't sort of like mosey about the like conversation circle they were standing at and take this like long circuitous route. They like have to sort of feel their way through the most efficient path, and high level players will be able to tell, okay, this character is kind of like sliding about a bit, or took this like big arc, and that kind of feels suspect.
Yep. And in that way, you can kind of see how the algorithm determined the gameplay, because you can imagine now if Chris were going to go change that algorithm for one that allows AIs to pick circuitous routes, you would drastically change the nature of the game, which maybe he might want to do. Like, that might make a better game, but it would definitely change the feel of the game. So you can almost see how the algorithms for the AI, in this game, a lot more than perhaps in other games, really would drastically change the feel of the game, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
But anyway, just to finish the answer to your question, so that's Dijkstra's algorithm, and what that does, as I said before, is it's not aware of a starting position. So what it does is it tells you the fastest route to City Hall from everywhere, right? It answered the question for everywhere. What A star does is say, look, most of the time I don't need to know the answer for everywhere. I just need to know the answer from a particular location, right? I'm starting somewhere and I'm ending somewhere. So what it does is it restricts which intersections it visits in that initial sort of walking out phase that I talked about. It avoids doing that for all intersections by saying at any time, I'm only going to go towards places that I believe to be close to the optimal route based on some other distance metric. So for example, in a 3D world like Spy Party, I know what the straight line distance is between these two characters, right? So I know that the minimum path could ever be is this long. I can never get there quicker than just walking straight from where I am to where I'm going, right? It can only ever get worse than that because I might have to avoid something, right? So all A star is it's, and I won't bother describing it in detail because it doesn't matter. It doesn't produce any different results. It's just a way of optimizing Dijkstra's algorithm by using that estimate to avoid visiting nodes in an unlikely order and knowing when you found the fastest route. So what it will do is it will bias the search for these nodes for the optimal paths in the graph. So to use my City Hall example, remember I said you start at City Hall and you go outwards from there. Well, instead of just going outwards randomly to whatever intersections there are, it will always pick the intersections to explore that have the current lowest time. And when it finally finds one path, it can know whether it's found the fastest path by knowing what the other estimates were along its route and knowing that they couldn't possibly have been better, right? So that's all A star is an optimization of Dijkstra's algorithm using principles that take into account the fact that typically you don't need to know the shortest path from everywhere, you just need to know the shortest path from a particular starting location.
Yeah, that's interesting that you bring up the point that it's very similar, but importantly more efficient. That feels like in perhaps any game, but also in a game like Spy Party, efficiency would be a major concern, especially with as you said, a potentially vast library of animations. I know. From the discussion you've validly brought up, you can't speak to the specific details of how this would work in Spy Party, but in general terms, what are ways that games are architected such that it's not really taxing on the game to search through all this animation data to find and play the appropriate animations? What are ways that this process is optimized or made expedient?
Well, let me just first make sure we disentangle two things there, because really, couple things. First of all, A star is probably in no way necessary for Spy Party. The number of characters doing pathfinding and the size of the graph is almost certainly low enough that Dijkstra's algorithm would have been fine. So I seriously doubt that's relevant. But I mean, like I said, I don't look at the code, so I'm not sure. But this is not a meaningful amount of computation for this. So Chris is probably just using A star just because that's what he sat down and implemented, because, hey, you might as well be a little bit more efficient, right? But it probably wasn't necessary in this case, because, again, he's just not looking at the kinds of performance things where if you had, 1,000 people graph finding over giant grids, then, yeah, you care. But if you're talking about, Rome Total War or something like this, right? But he doesn't have that kind of situation, so it was probably just hey, A star is probably the right thing to use here, so I used it, or something, but it wasn't really a prime efficiency concern. Then to disentangle that with the things in the next part, choosing animations is usually separate from pathfinding. So typically what happens is the pathfinding just ends up producing the lines that you should move along, right? It is then usually some higher level system's job to follow those lines by picking animations at the appropriate time, a walk cycle or a run cycle or a turning animation or whatever. And typically that is not really efficiency concern either, because typically it's done with relatively hand-coded stuff. It's basically a little thing that sits there and like, oh, if I'm going slowly, play this animation. If I'm going quickly, play this one. If I'm turning to the left, play this one, right? So while there are animation systems that do advanced pattern matching on geometrical requirements and stuff like this that do have a bunch of efficiency concerns wrapped up in them, I don't believe SpyParty is doing anything like that, at least at the moment. So it's not really relevant to this particular game.
Right.
Again, Chris could correct me if I'm wrong on that because I don't know what he's doing in the code, but I don't think he's doing anything like that.
Oh, okay, but like in general terms, like is it a difficult process for a game to run efficient? Like, I suppose depending on the game, it's going to have different methods of sort of searching for and finding particular animations. But you're saying because in situations like this, it tends to be hard coded. It's not like having to read through the entire library of animations to find the appropriate one. It's sort of told, okay, when you're in this state, pull out this animation. When you're in this state, pull out this animation.
Correct. That is exactly right. Typically, so usually the way to think about efficiency in game development terms, if you are a player, not a developer, so you're not, going down the rabbit hole of learning how everything really works in that kind of detail, usually you can just think of it in terms of how many things do I actually have involved in the process? And that usually gives you a pretty good idea of what kind of cost it will be to do something to those things. To give you sort of the broad overview, the most expensive thing that you can deal with are pixels, because there are way more pixels than anything else that there will be in a game, right? If you take a look at a frame that has to get computed, there are at least at 1080p, there's going to be 1920 times 1080 pixels, which is millions of pixels that have to get computed, right? So that is why we have a graphics card in our computers that do nothing but deal with this problem, because that is the most computationally intensive thing, because there's the most things that have to get solved. On top of that, usually comes triangles, so the basic rendering primitive that we use to generate those pixels. That's typically the next order of magnitude down, right? Sometimes now in games, it's the next order of magnitude up, because we're starting to get such detailed things. So sometimes it's that. Again, that's why we have a GPU in our computers, to deal with triangles and pixels, because there's so many of them. Same with texture maps, right? There's so many texels, all these like high-res texture maps used. Again, that's equivalent to pixels. They have to be typically roughly the same resolution to look good, and so on and so forth. So again, you can just think of these things as being incredibly many. Millions, sometimes billions of these things are happening per second, just a ton of them. So then you look down at something like how many animations there are per character, or how many characters there are in a game like SpyParty, and it's drastically less. There are not millions of characters animating. There are not millions of animations happening, right? There aren't even millions of keyframes of animation happening. It's on a much lower scale. And that's why you don't have a separate coprocessor, right, just for character animation. It's because it just doesn't happen at the same scale as something like rendering does. And so for something like SpyParty, the size of the animation bank and the number of characters isn't that large. So Chris has plenty of horsepower on an average CPU in modern days to do pretty much anything he wants, right? Now, sometimes you can increase this level of complexity up to the point where efficiency becomes a concern. And again, that's typically in scenarios where you've multiplied that number up so it starts to look more like triangles and pixels. If I want to have a giant battle between millions of combatants, like in, like a Rome Total War thing is probably millions, but there's a lot, hundreds of thousands. Now we start to get to situations where basic things like choosing animations or getting the right frame out of an animation we have to think about every little efficiency, because we're really doing it at a scale that will tax the computing resource we have. Right. But typically when you're talking about smaller sets of things, modern CPUs are so powerful that they just don't care. You're not talking about really having to be fastidious about efficiency in those circumstances. Hopefully, does that answer the question?
Yeah, it does. That's interesting too, because my background is more in 2D art, and I'd always thought of 3D as a much more complicated thing than 2D. But that kind of brings up a point that in 2D animated frames in a game is suddenly a concern, because those are large libraries of pixels that have to be sifted through instead of just being positional data.
Well, yes and no. It depends on what you're doing with the pixels. But again, yeah, in a sense, I guess the rendering process, you're absolutely right. In other words, it's just about how many pixels and texels we're dealing with, right? So if you have as many frames, like let's say you take something like Cuphead, right, which just has tons and tons and tons of frames of animation, that is a huge stress on, whatever the system is that has to get those things in and, put them to the GPU and animate them or whatever. If you make enough of them, it becomes costly, right? And so again, you probably can't do something like that without a huge amount of GPU RAM, right, to store it all and have access to it quickly, and a huge amount of bandwidth on that RAM to get it out of the RAM quickly into the GPUs, like processing engines and all that sort of stuff. So it does actually have those kind of characteristics. The reason that 3D tends to be so much more processor heavy is because, again, there's more stuff happening in there besides just having to move the text and the pixels. There's the triangles, like I said, is a thing that just doesn't really happen in 2D. So the structure of things just doesn't come into play in 2D very much, because the structure of 2D things is much simpler than the structure of 3D things. But the other thing that you have is typically in 2D, you don't do a lot of computation per pixel. You're typically talking about grabbing something from a 2D artwork and placing it into another 2D space, right? But with 3D, typically you're talking about a ton more computation. Lighting calculations, right? All these sorts of things that are creating sort of believable light transport just adds a ton more on top of it, right? And so, again, it's everything you do that's per pixel like that is just very, very expensive and requires a lot of horsepower because there's so many pixels. Anything you do per triangle, very, very expensive because there's so many triangles. Once you start getting away from those things, like in 2D, if you're talking about stuff you do per sprite, not very expensive because there's just not that many sprites on the screen. 100,000, 10,000, it's never a million, almost ever, and it's certainly not 10 million, right? So again, you get into those sort of economies of scale.
Huh. Interesting. Wow. Well, thanks very much for taking the time, Casey. That was just about all the questions I had. Were there any sort of topics or subject matters regarding 3D animation that you were interested in talking about, or does that feel like enough space covered to you?
Well, yeah, I mean, I obviously am happy to talk about whatever you thought was most interesting to the people who play Spy Party. So if that was the list, then that's great. Yeah, because I don't know, right, what people are most interested in. I don't have an outsider's perspective on a lot of this stuff, so it's hard for me to know when someone looks at a game, be it Spy Party or any other game. I don't know the sorts of things that pique their curiosity and which sort of things they just sort of don't care about as technical implementation details, right? Because different people get interested in different things. So anything you were interested in, as long as I answered it, then I'm a happy camper.
Yeah, no, you covered everything. So thank you very much for your time. I won't hold you up any longer. Any chance perhaps we could ring you in for another match of Spy Party sometime? I remember we played like one match and it went more or less well, I think.
Yeah, I think you taught me how to play it, if I remember correctly.
He does have a tutorial now, or soon, TM.
I should probably play some more Spy Party here. I will tell you what I tried to convince Chris to add, because when I played Spy Party, I'm not a really big competitive gamer is one of the problems. Like, Spy Party is a competitive gamer's game because it is 1 versus 1, tense, hyperactive game, right? Like, it is not, solitaire. It is a really, it's an engaging competitive game. I don't know how to say it. It's Street Fighter or something, right? It's like it's that kind of a game. And that's not, I don't tend to be quite so into those kind of games, so it's a little bit outside of my wheelhouse. But I tell you, when I was playing it, the thing that I said to Chris, and I was trying to convince him to do for people like me, was I just love watching the characters. Like, I have that voyeur instinct. Like, I'm the kind of person who looks into people's like apartments as I'm walking by and like sees what they're watching on television, right? And I make like judgments about the people, like, oh, they're watching a football game or something. Then I think, I construct fake personality profiles, right, of these people based on nothing other than like what I can see of their living room, right?
Did you play Tacoma? Sorry, this is a digression, but
I have not.
Okay, because if you have that voyeur drive, I think you would love the Fulbright Company's games, Gone Home and Tacoma, because they feed very much on that like voyeuristic interest, going through people's stuff in their personal space.
Okay, I'll have to give it a shot. I have not. Gone Home's been on my list of things to play for a while. I haven't had a chance to, but I'll give it I'll definitely check it out. But on the Spy Party front,
digression. Yeah.
What I found was that playing the spy, what I really wanted was I wanted a game where like I just look at this party, single player, and there's like things I have to discover. Like, just like, even if it was just like, figure out there's two people in this, at this party who are secretly having an affair, and at the end of like 10 minutes, it's going to ask me to pick who they were, right? I want to play like that game where I'm not going against anybody, and it's not like, oh, I've got to worry about tons of things that could be happening. I just want one thing I'm trying to augur into, and I get to like peek through everything and like see what I see about it, and then make a conclusion. Like, because he's done all the work of basically making that game as well as the one he made, and I'm like, I just want the like snooper mode, like private and PI mode. Like, give me a private investigator mode where somebody's hired me to figure out something, and I have 10 minutes to do it. Like, just give me that, right? And I'm sure I'll be unsuccessful in convincing him to deliver this game, but I feel like it would be a great game that basically has a lot of Spy Party in it, but for players who maybe can't get as much into the competitive nature of Spy Party itself. And it's also kind of more of a casually kind of thing. I could see playing that on the iPad, just kind of like kicking back for a game of like spying on people as opposed to Spy Party. But anyway, so that was my feeling on Spy Party, was that I really kind of loved that experience, but I couldn't quite get into the competitive aspects of it as much, because it's just a very tense game in that way.
Yeah. No, that's that discussion is actually very, very relevant and resonant to a lot of players that are discussing tutorials and like what a potential like single player mode should be. And yeah, that actually sounds very, very like of interest as an idea to a lot of players who are talking about, oh, you want something that's like can stand on its own for people who like perhaps aren't interested in like having a very like serious and intense adversarial experience, and want something more sort of like not casual, but something they can play in a more like leisurely, relaxed mindset. And it was interesting too. You brought up this point. You want an experience like as the spy, sort of observing the other guests. That is something that at a high level of competitive play, the spy does have to do. They have to be watching the other guests as well, because they're trying to figure out, okay, like, what do I think would look suspicious to the sniper, so that they can then like feed those suspicions instead of just sort of being aware of themselves and like neurotically thinking, oh, they must be looking at me. So something like that would actually have the added benefit of like training the player to like observe the party around them as they're milling about.
Well, I tell you, another thing that I think would be pretty amusing, that I'm sure it doesn't work for a number of reasons. I'm not a game designer, so I can't really speak to it. But one of the things that I always thought would be funny is like you could imagine a version of Spy Party that was persistent rather than match-based, which is the following. So at any time, I can boot up my Spy Party, and I am a sniper at a party, right? And I shoot spies when I find them, or tag them when I find them, for security to come and get. But I can just play for as long as I want, and I have no idea how many spies may come or go from my party. And so I'm just watching this party. I could watch a party for an hour, and maybe I find 5 spies. And later I find out there were actually 15 spies who came to my party at some point and left and stole some stuff or whatever, or did their mission, right? And the reason that I bring that up is because that also kind of solves the problem for me. Like the one-on-one match and the match is over when the spy is done thing doesn't create a super good environment for the thing that I want to do, which is just take my time observing each person when I want to, right? It forces me to, rather than be a voyeur, it forces me more to be like a TSA agent, right? I'm trying to look at everybody and see who the most suspicious person is. It doesn't allow me to focus on one person I'm interested in, follow them around for a while and get to know them, because if I did that, I'd be playing poorly.
Yeah, they call it tunneling.
Right. And so tunneling is the satisfying activity for some people, such as myself. And so the game mode that's in there now, because if you tunnel, you're a bad player, and your match will be over quickly. Because as soon as the spy knows that that's what you're doing, they'll just do all their things and be done. But there's an incredible value, I think, to allowing people to tunnel, because Spy Party as a game, when you boot, especially with all the new art, like once they got all the good artwork in there, you know, and there's a lot of like nice looking levels now, and the characters look cool.
Yeah.
You just want to see. I want to go watch, you know, like the gray-haired lady doing whatever she's doing. I just want to see what she's doing, and I can't. Right? I can't. It always kind of forces me to be a little bit distanced from them. And so that's why I say, like, the competitive aspects of it, if you get into that, you're golden, because, you know, the game's set up perfectly for that. But if you're someone, I feel like there's this other segment of people who could really enjoy the game if there were just some other, you know, because there's definitely, I feel like, existence proofs of other games that cater to different audiences. Like Deathmatch and Capture the Flag feel a lot different and cater to different people, I think, a lot of the times. And I hope that maybe someday Spy Party will have a mode that caters to tunnelers, for lack of a better term. Even if that's only single player, I'd still be, because I don't care about the multiplayer bit, I'd still enjoy playing the game single player if I could tunnel. Does that make any sense?
Yeah. No, that, I can tell you right now that there's going to be a lot of players listening to this who will be like very interested to hear that perspective, and I'm sure many who would like agree with you and be nodding their heads going, yeah, you know, that's something that I think would be like a valuable added feature to the game.
Well, if it turns out being one of the games that you know, gets updated a lot over time after it's released, then maybe that's, you know, something to be added or as an interesting new feature. But again, I'm not I don't really know game design very well, so that may also be a really dumb suggestion. So, you know, I apologize if I just said something that actually is stupid, but there you go. Not my area of expertise, let's put it that way.
There is a like 200-page suggestion threads. There are like plenty of the forum is a really valuable space for everyone to like share their input, and there's no like onerous on someone, you know, like ideas have to be like this good or that good. It's like, no, it's like fine to just like share ideas, and then, you know, we like all understand that at the end of the day it's Chris's decision of what's the sort of game he wants to make, and what does he have the like mental bandwidth to like actually like achieve. But there's like no harm in sharing your thoughts.
Yes, definitely.
Cool. All right. Well, thank you very much, cmuratori, for taking your time to speak with us.
Oh, it's my pleasure. Thanks for having me.